Welcome to Banking to Go by Algebra Labs, your takeaway insights from the world of financial technology and banking, served by today's industry leaders. My name is Nizamuddin, your host for today's episode, where we dive into how to raise the right capital with Sarah Kunst, founder and CEO of Cleo Capital. So Sarah, firstly, welcome to London officially. I could say that on camera now.
Yes.
Because you've moved here.
We have a place here. It's always funny. I travel so much for work that I'm
It's true. Where's home?
I'm still like in America every month, but I love London, even with the world's rainiest summer. I love it.
We've claimed you, so you're a Londoner now, whether you like it or not. So you're a Londoner. And that in itself is a brand. So Sarah, thank you for joining us on our Banking to Go podcast. The theme for this discussion broadly is how you raise the right capital. And so maybe I can start with a really fundamental question, which is our audiences are quite broad. We have people who build banks, CTOs, people who own banks right around the world. And we all hear about VC capital. And I've been in conversations where people assume they know what VCs do. They don't quite understand it. So maybe we could start off with a really basic, how does a venture capital fund work from the raise, from the LP to the distribution, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So VCs raise money to invest money, right? So we're in the business of raising money to functionally sell money to startups. And I think that it can feel as a startup founder, and I've been a startup founder, like sort of VCs have all the power and all the leverage and all the control, and they might in the interaction with you, but the reality is that, on the other side, we have bosses too.
Yeah.
We have to go raise money from limited partners, which could be anything from sovereign wealth funds to giant pensions, private or public, university endowments, just billionaire family offices, sometimes corporate, sometimes other venture or hedge funds. And so we have to go pitch them on our vision of the world, what we're going to invest in, with decks that look very similar to startup decks. And then they give us that money and we go out and invest it. We make money from when, the money comes back, right? So if you invest in the next Facebook and you put $1 million in, a decade or so later, you're probably going to get tens of millions back. And so you take 20% of that money that comes back. And then the other piece, and the rest goes to your investors. And then the other piece of it is fees. And so, at a startup, you raise money really just to spend it on your salary. For a venture fund, you only spend 20% of what comes in is what you have to use to fund all of your operations. And so if you have $1 million fund, that means that over 10 years, which is typically how long you deploy a fund for and how long a fund's life cycle is, you're only getting $20,000 a year or $200,000 total to use for expenses. And so if somebody has a $5 million fund, they are probably personally pretty poor in terms of the salary they could make from that fee, because it's just, that's not a ton of money. I
think you've painted a really powerful picture there, because I think very often you'll hear someone say, I'm a VC. And you think, it must be loaded, lots of money, but the reality is it's a complex picture. Thank you. So now, let's say I'm a fintech founder, part of a team that's founded a fintech in the UK, and we're looking to raise capital. And let's say it's a fintech, we know London is the heart of financial services. Would you recommend, as a startup founder, I know it's it's not a science, it's an art, that I go straight to VC money? Or do I bootstrap? Do I try and get some? How would you recommend? As an average startup founder
I think
focus?
that it depends on the idea. It also depends on the market cycle and timing. Consumer fintech was so popular, 5 years ago. And everybody wanted to invest in consumer fintech. Now that's cooled off. I personally think that's silly because we all live in if you are watching this on LinkedIn, you most certainly live in a fiat economy where you have to use money to do things, right? And so you're going to need tools to use that money. You're not just going to walk around with giant bags of cash. And even if you did, where did you get that cash from, right? And so the idea that consumer fintech is like a trend that's like off trend right now, I think is ridiculous. And the fact that I personally think it's ridiculous doesn't change the reality that a lot of investors who were investing in anything that had fintech in the name have now shifted, and they're all chasing AI or defense or robots or whatever. And that shift means that there is less money. That being said, you do need something before you go to investors, but that something is not a ton. It's genuinely, it's a pitch deck. It's the ability to talk at length about what the idea is and what it could look like at scale and what potential business models could be. It's understanding, sort of the basics of, hey, at scale, if you come to me and you say, oh, we have a really cool idea for a new credit card company and we're just going to charge 10% swipe fees, like that's not going to work. And it's probably illegal in most countries, right? So you could be really slick, but you have a business model. Like, I now understand that you don't understand the industry, so I'm not interested, right? Whereas you could be even earlier and come to me and, look at Stripe is the canonical example of this, right? It was a company started by teenagers who, were really they had an interesting insight, which is there is this little sliver of fintech that's really annoying. And we think that as big fintech companies grow, they're going to need this little kind of intermediary piece, right? And Plaid does it as well in a different way. And those companies were right about that. And they've been able to build huge companies. So even when you met those guys, you might be like, your literal children, like, what are you talking about? But I'm sure that they could have articulated a vision of a world that you go, that does make sense, and there's not companies doing it. Now, you would have wondered, is PayPal going to go do it? Is Chase going to go do it? Whatever. But the reality is this doesn't exist yet, and you understand what you're building. Those are the kinds of things that investors want to see much more than a working prototype. Like, I know, and and everybody knows that all it takes to get a working prototype of anything is enough money to hire an engineer to build it.
Spot on. And engineers around the world are very cheap.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that you've said, the pain point, right? Like what you're trying to fix is so important. I've learned through the journey of algebra and then through many other friends who are founders, the right investor is so important because I think capital is expensive and it can be even more expensive when you have the wrong type of person coming in. So, if you're, again, this doesn't have to be a startup per se, but like even Series A, Series B, from your experience, like how do you align as a founder on finding the right investor? Because actually somebody coming in with a 20K ticket could be worth $2 million because of their expertise, their wisdom, their nurturing talent. Somebody coming with 2 million could be really expensive because they're disruptive to the company and prevent progress. Yeah. How do you, when you're early, and obviously money is a challenge because I think that the environment's shifted. How do you filter for that?
Yeah. So, I like to say that if the terms are clean and the money's green, in America our money's green, I have no idea what color it is here. It's also made out of plastic here. I really struggle with British cash. But if the terms are clean and the money's green or whatever, you can take it if you need it, right? And I understand we all love to be in the position where we have the leverage to pick the exact perfect investor. And if you are in that position, that is amazing. And a lot of times I'll have founders come to me and say, how do I pick the right investor? And I'm like, well, how many term sheets do you have? And they're like, I don't. And I'm like, well, go get some, right? That's a second order problem. The first order problem is living to fight another day. You have to keep in mind that even if you love the investor in front of you in that moment, like things can change in the craziest ways possible. There's turnover at venture funds. So your investor might leave. You might get a random person on your board in their seat who you don't even, know. You might, if it's an individual family, they could go bankrupt. Or, I have one founder who he had this great, amazing, huge investor, the son of a billionaire family. They were super aligned, so excited. The guy died. The guy died in a car accident. Yeah. And it was tragic and insane. And the billionaire called him. He's like, I know my son loved this company, but like, I can't do that. I can't do anything right now. And so absolutely the craziest things can happen. And so having good, clean documents and having good, clean governance and having the ability to, have control over your company is so much more important, I think, than the person specifically on the other side of the table at that moment, because you don't know where they're going to be. And, and even just for the life of your company, right? You might have a great relationship with somebody, but if you step down and somebody else is running your company, they might not get along with that person as well. And so I think the terms are the most important part. Because then when the investor is trying to show up at your office every single day, you can say, sir, like, I am calling security because you don't have this right? This isn't, you didn't get a side letter in the investment saying that one of the terms is that, you get to stalk us.
Yeah.
No, leave.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important. And then beyond that, I do think that if you are competing, one of the biggest mistakes founders make when they do have multiple term sheets is they pick based on valuation, not on fit. And I promise you that picking somebody that you like a tenth as much because they're giving you a valuation that is, 20% higher is a mistake. It's an absolutely huge mistake. And then to your other point, having somebody not taking small checks all the time, founders are like, oh, we're only taking checks at X size.
Yeah.
It's the wrong conversation to have, right? Because if I am Bill Gates and I want to give, and you say our minimum check size is 100K. Me giving you 100K is like, I don't know, free. It's like a net, like you mean nothing to me, right? I drop 100K and I don't even notice it. If you as an angel are like, wow, like 50,000 is a lot for me, 25,000 is a lot for me, but I believe in this and I want to help you and I'm going to work so hard for you, they're much better off taking that. And so the conversation I have even with my own investors, when they talk about minimums and, I ask kind of what's your average check size? Because I don't necessarily want to be somebody's smallest check. I once had an investor I asked that to, and he said, well, it's my average check size is bigger than what I'm offering you, but I generally invest in people I actually know, and I've known you for like the 15 minutes of this phone call. And I was like, that's a really fair point. And I took the money, right? So it is something you have to think about, and trying to make a simple, hard and fast rule, I think, costs you money. With bigger investors, it can, or deeper pockets. And I think it costs you money and amazing help and support with smaller investors.
Really insightful wisdom. I want to touch on values-based companies, right? Like, so if you're solving for a social problem or an ethical problem, one of the things that we at Algebra focused on was building an ethical financial system. You may have other companies that exist that are focused on the climate. We saw during 2020-21 in the US and in the UK, a lot of companies focusing on racial inequality. How do you balance, firstly, should VCs be focused on fixing these problems? I guess, let's touch on that. Should VCs be focused on fixing those kinds of problems?
I mean, I think every company is a values company. You can't not be, right? If you're an oil company, you are saying something about your values in the world. If you're a arms manufacturer, you're saying something about your values in the world, right? If you are X, formerly known as Twitter, and you are like excitedly platforming, certain kinds of people, you're saying something about your values. You're always saying something about your values. The question is what you want that to be. And the way that I see it is, there's a lot of ways to make money in the world. And I would rather make money in ways that make the world a better place, and not necessarily only for the social good, right? You look at something like climate change, and in the US, we have much more extreme weather than we do here. It's a pain. I have a friend in Texas who was helping me with a deal that I'm looking at, and I wanted him to review it last weekend. There's a hurricane. They don't have power. They're not going to have powers for days. It's like 100 degrees. They have to look at. That's like literally costing me money because I need him to give me feedback on this investment so that I can decide if I want to do it. And so the reason that I think about, climate change isn't just sort of what kind of world do I want my great-great-grandchildren to live in. It's costing me money now, right? When I lived in New York years ago, there was a huge hurricane, and my building didn't have power for weeks and we had mold problems and just all this great, that is costing me time and money now, right? And so the reason to care about a lot of these things, or the way to think about these things, right? Personal safety and harassment on the internet, like what kind of company do you want to build? All of these things, right? Cybersecurity I've been looking at more recently, and especially in fintech, there's so many scams. There's so anytime you go to like trade money anywhere. When I first got here, I was trying to buy stuff on Facebook Marketplace. I wanted a couch. Impossible, because everybody thinks that you must be scamming them, and you're like, hey, I like your couch. Can I send you money to your bank account, and can I send a Shipley to pick up the couch? They're like, nice try, scammer. And I'm like, I want a couch.
I want to give you money.
Yes,
Yeah.
right? But because that trust has eroded, because there are so many scammers, it's really hard to transact. And so the reason that I care about the values of the companies I invest in is literally because I want a couch, as much as often, because I want to live in a world that doesn't reward crime.
And what you've described there perfectly is how I also think we fix problems of society, is you repurpose it in a way that aligns with commerciality, right? And so I have a question that I've been really grappling with more recently, which is, so say, climate change is affecting all of us. It's unquestionable. And I was thinking about how capital plays such an important, money allocators play such an important role in addressing some of the biggest problems of our day, especially when it's like, catastrophic. We've seen recently the Caribbean, we've seen horrific.
So I was in the Caribbean the week before that.
Oh my goodness.
I was in Cayman, Grand Cayman, for a speech I was giving, and actually to a bank. And it's crazy to say, oh my gosh, like we happened to have already left, and we hadn't extended the vacation. Otherwise, be trapped there.
So it's existential is the point. And so therefore the question is, what more can money allocators do? So let's say you're a VC and you have portfolio companies. What can you do? What can you flex to your portcos right now to get them to do the right thing and be commercially viable? One. And two, is that something that we think we should be doing more of? Because otherwise we'll keep going as this BAU approach where, your LP wants 10 to 20% return after a 7-year window. Do we start taking more drastic action? And what could that look like?
Yeah, so the way that I tend to approach it is looking at the business opportunities. And, I am an obsessive shopper. I love shopping, and I love designer, vintage. It's just cooler and more interesting. Anybody with a credit card with a high enough limit can walk into a store right now. There's a reason that Hermes bags are so desired, because of the scarcity, right? It's not scarce to walk into Dolce & Gabbana right now and buy something that they have in store, but to find an archival Gianni Versace piece that Cindy Crawford wore on the runway 20 years ago is almost impossible, right? I mean, you literally basically have to break into Cindy Crawford's house, which don't, because she probably has very good security. Don't do it. Leave Cindy alone, right?
Cindy alone.
Or like you can go right now to the V&A to the Naomi Campbell exhibit. Definitely don't steal from Naomi Campbell. You will not be safe. Yeah. But the reality is that these pieces are so special, they're so rare, and to me, they're much more desirable and cheaper and better for the environment than just walking into a store and buying something new. And so, the way that I think about that, and so I've invested in some companies that are in the resale business, right? That are in this space. And to me, it's because of that piece of it. It's, hey, this is a massive, massive, massive market. And yes, some people are coming to pre-owned because of sustainability stuff. But I mean, go ask anybody who has a classic Rolls Royce, right? They're not buying, a whatever 1940s Jaguar because of the sustainability piece of it. They're buying it because it's a really cool car. It's a much bigger flex than driving around in a 2025 Range Rover that any idiot with a credit card can buy. And so I think that understanding that, okay, I believe X. I believe fast fashion and sweatshops are bad. Okay, so I can go like protest or something, I guess, or I can say, where is the business case against this, right? And by the way, you look at companies like Shein that are having trouble finding an exchange to list on, and you know, there's a lot of issues in that business. And then you look at companies that are just doing really well by being more thoughtful and having, you know, a better sort of business proposition that is more sustainable. And so to me, it's following the money and invest. I'm not going to invest in a founder of a fast fashion company because that's not something I'm personally excited about on a lot of levels. But I'm not going to invest in that founder and then try to get them to like find sustainability. It's, hey, why don't I go find somebody who's already doing it? Because my job as an investor is to find a founder who's building a version of the world that I'm excited about and to give them money, not to try to tell them to switch their version of the world that they're building. And one thing I say internally a lot to my team when we're on the fence about something is like, you could just go be an arms dealer. Right? Like at some point, although actually weirdly, a lot of the gun companies are going bankrupt, but somehow there's so many guns and the whole thing is crazy. But you can, like, is this really what you want to be doing with your time? Is this really, you know, why are we trying to find the worst, like the edge, like put our toes over the edge of the worst possible thing we could do versus saying like, what's the best possible thing? And how do we get excited about and make money from the best possible thing we could do instead of the worst?
No, I love how you've structured your answer there. Instead of, like you say, pulling these hard strings with your portfolio companies, actually the entire thing should be directed in positive growth, sustainable, whatever it is that you believe in. You know, the last 3 years have been very tough for broadly the money markets and for the VC space. We've seen the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. We've seen inflationary pressures. We've seen interest rates go up. One example that you gave was like, you know, consumer fintech down. And, you know, we all hear the buzzwords, right? Like, no, SaaS only now. Like, you know, we're into B2B, no B2C. What trends have you seen in that time? And what have you thought is, you know, this is going in the right direction? Others, you think this is just crazy nonsense?
So I think the interesting trends I've seen that I think founders don't hear about a lot or think about a lot, but every VC talks about it behind closed doors, is sort of the timing and structure of rounds, meaning that a lot of companies, call it seed and beyond, who raised big rounds in 2021, 2022, they raised at high valuations, they raised a decent amount of money. A lot of them did layoffs, huge layoffs pretty quickly after that because of the rising interest rates, particularly in the US, and sort of the Sequoias of the world coming out with a little bit of a doom and gloom, you know, batten the hatches type of thing. And so a lot of them have been sitting on a ton of cash, and the only way that they're going to raise more money is if they're getting a higher valuation. But with their valuation was, you know, 100 million for a seed or a Series A for a company that has no revenue and 5 employees, whatever, they're not going to get that 200 million now, or even 150 million valuation. And so because of that, they end up just not raising again. And so there's been sort of this mismatch, right? Raising money is a bidding market, just like the stock market. If no one wants to buy, then you can't sell, right? And if no one wants to sell, then you can't buy. And what we've been seeing in venture over the last couple of years is a lack of that liquidity in the market. Founders don't want to raise at a price that investors are willing to invest. And that's slowly starting to change. One, there's more money coming back into the market. And then two, there's also the founders are finally kind of running out of money for these companies, and they need to raise more. But I think that's been a big thing. And then when no one's raising, VCs tend to get a little bit pencils down. They're not looking at a ton of deals. VC is a momentum game, so when you're not looking at a ton of deals, it's a little bit harder to get excited about the deals that do come across. All of those things have been happening, and they have nothing to do with companies in trend areas or anything else. They just have been happening in the macro, and it massively impacts your ability to raise money in the micro, right, for your company.
So on that, there's an interesting dislocation that we all know about but never talk about, which is the following, right? So, one, the flow of money, right? So a lot of the big funds that we have in America, the UK, at some point, a lot of that capital does come from the East, the big sovereigns, right? But then if you go to the East and you see some incredible tech companies emerging out of, say, South Asia or Africa, they're brilliant. And honestly, their tech is often better, the teams are brilliant, they're more vibrant, they have great traction, good money, they are making revenue. Then you look at their valuation and you compare it to a company that is nowhere near in, say, the UK or the US, and their valuation is like 3 times high. And I've always wondered, like, it's a dislocation that we know, and we know it exists. Like, how do you reconcile that? And this is a very, it's a philosophical question, I guess, right? Because we know why. It's money markets, it's liquidity, it's exit. Like often the valuation comes from the fact that you can exit in an IPO or somebody will buy it, and those capital markets are higher in the West or in Europe and in the UK and America. But it's still unfair. Right, ultimately, and because of historical fault lines, right? Often, you can say colonial history, et cetera, et cetera. How do we fix for those? Because a lot of the companies that we work with in terms of building digital banks and working with them are in those parts of the world. And you go there and you think, this is just unfair. And I'd love your thoughts on how again, I don't expect an immediate solution, but it's something I think about all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that there is sort of this really messed up kind of Western perspective, which is, hey, a few hundred years ago, we went in and completely destroyed these continents. And at least as much of the continents that we could get our hands on, we destroyed. And then now that they're totally messed up and sort of stuck in this cycle of just all of the things, we don't want to invest in them because they're unstable. And it's we can't really use the passive voice in this, friends. I guess I can, you can, but not the rest of you, because you are the ones who created this instability, right? And I think that the bright spot or the silver lining, and where you see some workaround to that, has really been Y Combinator has been a big part of this, but getting those companies to just incorporate in America, because there is, right? There's the cultural piece, meaning that, do I think that founders in Nigeria or Ghana, are just as smart and just as amazing and probably 10 times, more people that I want to back than people in Silicon Valley? Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And I've never been to those places. And even if I go for a couple weeks, a couple months, whatever, I'm still not going to be as understanding of, the culture. And I mean, the fault lines I step into here, right? In London, which is 5 hours from New York, where, I've lived a huge portion of my life, it's a big difference. And so one, there is that. And then there's also the legal piece of it, right? The underlying, it is really good when a lot of American investors will invest in the UK and Canada, in part because there's similar legal systems, common law and things like that are our lawyers can wrap their heads around it and say, yeah, you can probably do this. But then there's also questions like our LPA. So our agreements as investors with our investors, our LPs, our LP agreement, our LPA often prohibits investing in either companies that do all their business in other countries, outside of maybe a short list, or maybe just the US or the country we're in. And then companies that are where you're investing in a legal entity outside of the US, because you can have a US entity, a Delaware C Corp, and never set foot in the US. And that does make it a lot easier for exits, for acquisitions, for IPOs, all of that, and certainly easier for fundraising. So there's different rules that we have sometimes, the smaller funds who are more likely to go look in those places. There's also the logistics. I have a friend who's on the board at Canva. He flies from San Francisco to Australia 3 to 4 times a year for a board meeting. And that's brutal. I love that company. I would definitely not do that, right? And so some of those questions, and it's obviously easier here. You're like, Sarah, you do know that whatever, most of Africa is a 4-hour flight. From San Francisco though, you're talking about 12-hour time difference and 15, 20 hours on a plane. That's a lot of business days. Yeah. And so, and you're doing that 4 times a year for multiple companies, and you have to go on more trips to source and the jet lag. And so now all of a sudden, and so there are real barriers. And I think that the smart way to get over those barriers are things like, one, just acknowledging it, right? That the reason that you're not investing in these countries is a mix of sort of the historical things that probably your individual ancestors were a part of and that you certainly benefited from. And then two, the structural barriers, right?
The legal,
and so like understanding those two things and then making a commitment to say, how do I work around that? And then when you find a company, or like if you invest in funds, investing in funds that are active in those regions, or, when you find a company that is investing in those regions or active, or a company in those regions that like is also domiciled in the US or the UK or whatever, so you can write that check, and like, the founder is somebody who's coming to you through like Y Combinator or through, some other network that you're already allocating into, like write that check, because and then as you do that, it becomes a learning lesson. So then you can learn more about those markets, and then you can go through. And as you learn more, you have more fluency and more ability to write more checks. And so it is a muscle. And also I think acknowledging, the easy out is sort of, these geopolitical situations, right? And these countries do have very fluid geopolitical situations. And so does this one.
Totally.
And so does America.
So
does France.
I was about to say, I think where we're headed into geopolitically in the world.
Yeah, World War III, baby.
Yeah,
like everything's crazy.
Yeah, stay away from Cindy, from Naomi in World War III. I mean, the volatility is everywhere. And I think what's even more frustrating when you have this conversation, you think about it, is a lot of these economies, societies, jurisdictions are second, third movers, i.e., for example, like, there's better Wi-Fi in Myanmar in the forest than there is in Mayfair.
San Francisco, I had the worst time in San Francisco doing Zoom calls, to the point where I sometimes can't do, I do a lot of TV. I can't do TV hits because the Zoom is so bad. The Wi-Fi in the heart of Silicon Valley is too bad.
Because we're legacy systems, and these countries have piggybacked where we left off, started there, and have way better adoption, and I find that just ironic, is the best way to describe it. But I think it's a really important thing to talk about. So like in this really busy, congested market, I think about AI, and I think about how, it's the hot potato, it's what everyone's talking about. And I think about VCs who are investing heavily in it, and how a lot of the caution that you may have, because you have FOMO, right? Like you have LPs behind you who are like, invest in the next big thing. And you have a lot of FOMO because there's a lot of people claiming with the words AI, like the words deep or AI, and you've got to go back it. How do you caution against like backing the wrong thing? And I don't want to name names, but there are companies that should not have been backed, that have bad governance that we've talked about, that have bad leadership, that have been backed, that then people have had to be, embarrassed, walked back, and then you recommit some money because you're in, right? Like you can't go back and lose that money. You go in again. How do you prevent that?
So I think a lot of that stuff comes down to understanding, especially in the case of AI and all these deep tech things, understanding what success will look like for these companies and who can be successful. So, I spend a lot of time covering AI on TV, on financial shows. I mainly am excited about the legacy stocks. I love Taiwan Semiconductor. It is a company that is a fabricator of most AI chips for everybody, for NVIDIA, for Apple, for everybody, right? I like NVIDIA. I like Intel. These are really old companies. And you know why the really old companies are winning at this? Because it takes years and years and years and years and years and years and years, right? Even the like Apples, and Apple designed some of their own chips, but even the Apples and especially like the Facebooks and Googles of the world, like Google's been working on generative AI for a decade plus. A lot of the people who, were writing some of those foundational papers and research have gone on to start other companies like OpenAI and others. But like those people, these are very long-term games. And even cryptography to some extent. Cryptocurrency came from cryptography, which has been around for a long time and has a lot of applications in banking and stuff for security. But so understanding that, and then understanding what is the capital requirements, right? Well, how much money has NVIDIA raised over it's like 30 years in business, right?
Yeah.
And understanding that there's probably not quick wins. And when a founder comes to you and tells you they have a way to get a quick win in this space, it's probably not real. And I think that there are some spaces where foundational knowledge doesn't do you much good. Everybody passed on Facebook initially. Everybody passed on Uber initially because they're like, that's not how these markets work, right?
Yeah.
But those were software innovations. Those were consumer behavior innovations. They were really software innovations to some extent, but they were mostly consumer behavior innovations. AI chips are not consumer behavior innovations. The usage of them, the utilization will be a little bit, although I think most AI will be buried and it's just going to be happening on the back end, the same way that, none of us call Siri or Alexa AI, but absolutely that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's different when you're talking about building foundational tech, right? When you cannot do anything, the sort of Mark Zuckerberg is college dropout, oh my God, this is what you want to back. Sure, right? I love a lot of Meta's products. I live on Instagram, whatever. But the reality is that it is very hard to learn enough in 1 year of college after, however many years of other school to be able to turn around and build an AI chip. Like you're not learning that in kindergarten. And I don't care how many of your, parents' old computers you take apart, there's no AI chip in there that you're, a nano chip, right? That fits on like a tiny piece of your fingernail. You can't take that apart the same way you can take apart a radio. And so I think that there's a lack of scrutiny often because of the FOMO for investors to really look at first principles of like, how does this stuff get made? Who makes it? How do you make it? Like, where are the patents? Where's the IP? What do you need to know to do this? And then once you start to dig in on that, you say, oh, this is probably not going to look like, the app revolution and consumer software. Maybe we shouldn't be throwing money at somebody because they claim that they have a whatever degree from Oxford they just haven't picked up yet.
I tell you, that gives me hope. It's go back to fundamentals piece, which is so powerful. Let me ask you finally, how do you personally stay informed of innovations? I mean, there's so much happening in so many places, and we have this attention deficit, and there's everything everywhere on Instagram, on TikTok, on there's information website, there's so many things now. Where do you personally, as Sarah, stay focused and think?
It is the saddest, truly saddest thing of my life is that I can't have TikTok on my phone because then I can't do anything else at all because there's so much drama in the world, so much niche, petty drama happening to other people that I need to watch that I can't be on TikTok.
And you're honest about it.
I can't. Yeah. I literally can't. It is not on my phone.
Very fair.
Instagram can do that, but it's not quite as addictive. The AI just isn't quite there yet. I can still have a life and get things done. A lot of it is being observant and having a little bit of like a beginner mind. And so, I love Apple News. I love Apple News. I think it's the best $10 or whatever you can spend a month. Maybe it's 13 now, who cares? The best. I'm constantly just reading and it's random stuff. It's like some popular mechanics article about, cow manure and whatever. Like it's the most random things because when you're and I read all my industry stuff, right? I have my Bloomberg subscription and I'm reading all the financial stuff. I'm reading all the obvious stuff for my, tech and finance. That's usually not where I'm reading the same thing everybody else is, right? I have no edge. I don't,
exactly right, yeah.
It's the random niche-y things where you're like, wait a minute, like the rise of actually for TikTok, the rise of like plumbers on TikTok. And you're like, okay, what? Like, what's actionable? Where's the deal to be done there? Well, think about it, right? We live in a world where for the last 20, 30 years, even more than that, but certainly last 20, 30 years, the only way to be successful, the only way to like make it in life is like to go to a university and get like a fancy white collar job so you can sit at a desk hating your life all day. And in America, you get like 2 weeks of vacation a year. It's terrible, whatever. And you have tons in America, tons and tons and tons of student loan debt. And now all of a sudden, a friend of mine liked to say, it was a congressman in Massachusetts, liked to say that plumbers make more than lawyers in Massachusetts because there are so many lawyers with so much law school debt that they have to pay off. And there are so few plumbers. And guess what? When your toilet breaks,
Do you need a plumber?
like you need a plumber, right?
Yep.
You might need a lawyer too to sue your landlord, but you need a plumber in the moment.
Yeah.
And so plumbers make more. And so, thinking about that, and I haven't yet found a deal that I've done in that space, but really turning it over and over and over in my head, like a Rubik's Cube of like, what does it mean that we're realizing this huge value, and people are realizing lifestyle wise, like if you've never enjoyed sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day, you're not suddenly going to start liking a white collar job. If you love to do stuff with your hands and be outside and moving around and stuff, you probably will be happier as a directional driller or a plumber or construction worker, whatever. And so what does it mean that the skilled trades are coming, back into relevance, right? And they've never left relevance, but like they're now something that kids are realizing they can make more money and be much happier. And so as that kind of thing happens, like really literally, now I'm super in the weeds on it. It started because I read some random article about how everybody has a crush on hot plumbers on TikTok.
I wish we could delve even deeper into the social implications of this, because I think in the UK, there's a class structure.
Yes.
But another conversation for another day.
Yes.
Sarah, thank you so much for your time. That was fascinating.
Thank you.